the somber family courtroom, the crisp rustle of Judge Harrison's papers abruptly ceased. His eyes hidden behind bifocals rose in surprise, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath. All heads turned, searching for the source of the unusual sound. "I am my mother's lawyer." It was David Thompson, a boy who was only 9 years old. Instead of trembling, his clear voice cut through the solemn courtroom atmosphere like a sharp blade, drawing all eyes to him. David stood next to his mother, Janet. She looked at her son with a complex mixture of fierce pride and abject fear. Her heart pounded a surging tide of emotion that made her want to both hug him and protect him from the storm, and also let him speak his own mind with confidence. Across the aisle, Robert Wellington, the third David's biological father, a slick Chicago real estate mogul in an expensive designer suit, nearly choked on the coffee he was sipping. His face flushed red, his usual arrogance giving way to sheer astonishment and extreme annoyance. Judge Harrison, regaining his composure, looked at the scrawny boy with oversized glasses. He tried to be patient, but it came out as stiff. "I'm sorry, young man, but this is a legal proceeding for adults. You can't possibly—" "I know, Your Honor," David calmly interrupted him. He adjusted his glasses with a decisive gesture like a scholar. His worn student notebook, filled with careful handwritten notes in blue ink on white paper, was opened. "I also know that under Article 12 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which the United States ratified, I have the right to express my opinion on matters that directly affect me. In this case, it definitely affects me." A chilling silence fell over the room. The quietest breaths, the smallest movements became painfully clear in the taut atmosphere. Robert Wellington, a man used to being in control of everything, now looked helplessly at his two high-priced lawyers, Dr. Mitchell and his associate, with a look that could set them ablaze, as if he wanted to wring their necks right then and there. He couldn't believe a 9-year-old could humiliate him like this, much less dare to quote international law. He was completely unprepared for this situation. No one could have guessed a child would be so meticulously prepared. Janet, who worked 60 hours a week as a nurse's assistant to raise David alone, felt her heart seize. She knew the burden David was carrying their life together, every penny she earned from extra shifts. For the past 8 years, since Robert learned he was David's father, he had appeared in the boy's life only 4 times. 4 brief visits, always accompanied by expensive gifts and hollow promises of a bright future. He would provide promises that all vanished like soap bubbles. Now he was suddenly demanding full custody, a sudden change that left Janet deeply suspicious. Dr. Mitchell, Robert's lead lawyer, cleared his throat quickly, trying to regain his professional demeanor. He adjusted his tie. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The child has no legal standing to—" David interrupted him with startling composure, which made several adults in the room shift uncomfortably in their seats. "If you are truly concerned with my welfare, you would want to hear what I have to say instead of trying to silence me." Robert Wellington leaned down and whispered something urgent into Dr. Mitchell's ear. His eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and anxiety. But David didn't allow any interruptions. The boy continued, his small fingers flipping through the notebook with the precision of someone who had practiced this thoroughly. "Your Honor." The boy's voice rang clear, each word emphasized. "I have prepared a documented presentation on why I should stay with my mother, including evidence of the petitioner's true motives." He paused, his gaze meeting Robert's for the first time. It was a direct, fearless look that held a cold accusation. "Motives which I believe the court will find very interesting." Robert Wellington's face visibly paled. A chill ran down his spine. He wondered what had David discovered. How could a 9-year-old have prepared for this trial more thoroughly than he and his $1-million legal team? The entire courtroom held its breath. Everyone sensed they were witnessing something extraordinary. A boy seemingly frail was holding secrets that could topple an empire built on lies. Dr. Mitchell, an experienced lawyer, quickly regained his composure. He cleared his throat, trying to dispel the initial confusion. "Your Honor, while we admire the young man's creativity, this court handles complex family law matters that require proper legal representation." "Then why didn't you provide me with one?" David asked, his voice carrying a bitterness and a weariness of a child who had to grow up too soon. He closed his notebook with a dry clack. a small sound that echoed like a gunshot in the deafening silence of the room. In the 8 months this case has been going on, none of Mr. Wellington's brilliant lawyers, or even this court itself, thought it was important to hear the opinion of the person most affected by this decision. I'm the only one who actually lives this life, but my voice has been ignored. Robert Wellington shifted restlessly in his chair. He was extremely uncomfortable with his son's unusual calm. David showed no fear of the solemn setting, the expensive legal team, or his own intimidating presence. It made Robert both angry and a little panicked, mixed with a feeling of powerlessness he had never experienced before. Janet looked at her son. Her eyes filled with a jumble of emotions, the burning pride for David's courage, but also a simmering panic about what she didn't know about him. She remembered weeks ago David bringing home strange books from the library, civil codes guides to children's rights court precedents. She thought it was just the academic curiosity of a bright child, a sign of his superior intellect. She never imagined he was quietly preparing for a tough legal battle like this. A complex swirl of emotions churned inside her, wanting to both hold him and protect him, and also let him confidently speak his own mind. Dr. Mitchell continued trying to regain control of the situation. Your Honor, my client, Mr. Robert Wellington, is seeking custody because he genuinely cares about his son's welfare. Miss Thompson, while well-intentioned, simply lacks the resources to provide the educational and social opportunities a gifted child like David deserves. He looked at Janet with a judgmental gaze, hinting at her inadequacy compared to Robert's wealth. Genuine care, David murmured, his voice laced with sarcasm as if talking to himself. He slowly reopened the notebook, a deliberate and unhurried motion, as if to prolong the suspense. Your Honor, may I share a few facts about this genuine care? Judge Harrison, who had presided over hundreds of custody disputes, had never seen such a bizarre situation. On one hand, he had to follow the strict rules of the law. On the other, this child was showing a clarity, sharpness, and preparation that far exceeded many adults. And he couldn't help but be intrigued and curious. David, Janet whispered her son's name, her voice filled with worry. Perhaps we should let the lawyers. Which lawyers, Mom? David gently cut her off, his voice still full of conviction. We can't afford Dr. Mitchell or his colleagues, so either I speak for us or no one does. Robert Wellington finally couldn't sit still. He stood up, his face showing clear annoyance and a hint of anger. David, son, I know this situation is confusing for you, but don't call me son. The words came out with a cold, surprising finality that made several adults in the room shiver. David looked directly at Robert, his gaze unwavering, holding only resentment and a quiet pain. In my 9 years of life, you've appeared exactly 4 times. 2 times on my birthday, always 3 weeks late. Once for Christmas, when you had 20 minutes between social events, and once when the local paper did a piece on philanthropic businessmen, and you needed a picture with a child. Those are the moments when your care for me was on display. The silence that followed was deafening. Robert lowered his head, unable to face David's gaze. He opened his mouth to object, but David didn't give him a chance. The boy continued, his voice steady, but holding a suppressed rage that had built up for years like a drill boring through Robert's flashy facade. The last time we met was 6 months ago, and you were in our apartment for 15 minutes, long enough to criticize the furniture, complain about the smell of the medicine my mom brings home from the hospital, and suggest that I might have potential if I had a decent education. David adjusted his glasses, a cold, sharp smile briefly flickering on his lips. Interestingly, 2 weeks after that, you filed for full custody. Dr. Mitchell hurriedly whispered something urgent to Robert, his face pale. But David wasn't finished. The boy had been preparing for this moment for a long time, and he wouldn't miss his chance. He continued, his voice growing more and more certain, full of the weight of undeniable evidence. Your Honor, I've done my research on my biological father. I've discovered that he just lost a very expensive lawsuit with his business partners. I've also discovered that his third wife has filed for a contested divorce. In the tense courtroom, David's clear voice continued like an arrow aimed straight at the heart of the truth. And I have discovered something very interesting about a trust fund established by my late grandmother. Robert Wellington's face went from flushed to ghostly white in a matter of seconds. The notorious real estate mogul, a man who was always in control, was now frozen. How could a 9-year-old boy have uncovered information that even his most seasoned lawyers, the ones with a mastery of the law, did not know? David turned a page in his notebook, and for the first time since entering the courtroom, a smile flickered on his lips. It wasn't the innocent smile of a child. It was the smile of someone holding the winning hand, a sharp and confident smile, ready to deliver the final blow. "But before we discuss inheritances and financial motives," David said, closing his notebook as if to draw out the suspense to its absolute limit, "let's discuss why a man who has never shown any real interest in being a father has suddenly developed such a strong paternal instinct." Robert Wellington was now visibly sweating. Beads of sweat dotted his forehead, betraying his extreme anxiety. His expensive legal team looked completely flustered, their eyes filled with confusion and helplessness. None of them were prepared to face a child who seemed to know more about their client's financial situation than they did. What had this 9-year-old boy discovered during quiet afternoons at the public library? And how could a child have gathered information that adults with unlimited resources and professional investigators couldn't? A sense of mystery surrounded David, making everyone in the room wonder. Judge Harrison leaned forward, his curiosity clearly piqued. In his 30 years on the bench, he had never seen a child this articulate, sharp, and calm in his courtroom. "David, you mentioned evidence," he said, his tone a mix of surprise and a hint of respect. "What kind of evidence could a 9-year-old possibly gather?" David adjusted his glasses, a gesture that had now become his signature in the courtroom, like a habit to solidify his focus and composure. "Your Honor, in the 3 months since I found out about this case, I have spent every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon doing research at the Central Public Library." Dr. Mitchell, with undisguised contempt, interrupted. "Research on what?" "Public records, newspaper archives, available corporate documents, Mr. Wellington's past lawsuits," David replied methodically, completely unfazed by the lawyer's attitude. He opened a new section of his notebook, and a look of pride appeared in his eyes. "The head librarian, Ms. Rodriguez, has a master's degree in information science and taught me how to access basic legal databases." Janet looked at her son in utter disbelief. For months, David had said he was working on a special project at the library. She had never for a second imagined that the project was to save their family, to protect their life together from the cruel interference of an irresponsible father. A wave of powerful emotions washed over her: love, fear, and an absolute faith in her son. Robert Wellington finally exploded, his self-control completely gone. "This is ridiculous. A 9-year-old boy digging into my private life like a private detective." "Public information, sir," David calmly corrected him, his voice unwavering. "It's all legal and accessible to any American citizen regardless of age." Ms. Rodriguez, the head librarian, had become more than just a guide to David. When the boy first appeared asking about how family court works, she quickly realized it was not simple academic curiosity. It was the desperation hidden beneath the determined exterior of a child looking for a way out for himself and his mother. "He's been here regularly for 3 months, she had told Janet last week when she finally called out of concern. "He reads legal codes the way other kids read comic books. He's learning at an impossibly fast rate." David continued his presentation methodically, every word a piece of undeniable evidence. "I found that in the past 18 months, Mr. Wellington has faced 3 major lawsuits. He lost a $2.3 million dispute with former partners at Wellington Industries. And even more interesting, his current wife, his third wife, has filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences, which is code for him hiding money from her." Robert's face was beet red with anger, his eyes blazing. "How dare you!" "And what's even more interesting," David interrupted, his small fingers systematically turning each page as if turning over dark secrets. "I discovered that my late grandmother, Mrs. Eleanor Wellington, established a trust fund worth $1.7 million specifically for me, which can only be accessed when I turn 18 or when my biological father gains full legal custody." The room fell into an absolute silence. Everyone's breathing seemed to stop. Dr. Mitchell whispered something urgent to Robert, but he completely ignored him. His eyes fixed on David, filled with panic. "Your Honor, this is not a coincidence," David continued, his voice ringing clear without a hint of doubt. "My grandmother passed away when I was 2. For 7 years, Mr. Wellington never mentioned my existence to her, never took me to see her, never let her know she had a grandson. Janet vividly remembered Robert's cruel words from years ago. My family doesn't need to know about it. He had called his own son it, a cold, impersonal pronoun. But when Mrs. Eleanor Wellington found out about me through a private investigation which I found in the probate records, she immediately established the trust with a very specific condition. David paused dramatically, knowing everyone in the room was hanging on his every word, holding their breath in anticipation. The money would be disbursed for my care and education only if my father demonstrated a genuine commitment to the child's welfare by gaining legal custody. If he never sought custody, the money would go directly to me at 18 without passing through my parents. The math was simple, but cruel. Robert had ignored David for 9 years, missing the opportunity to access the inheritance through natural custody. Now, bankrupt and desperate from his failed lawsuits and expensive divorce, he was trying to force a late custody claim to access the trust fund. "But there's one thing my grandmother couldn't have foreseen," David said, closing the notebook, his eyes showing both cunning and a deep sadness. "She didn't know her son would make a career of destroying small family businesses with predatory tactics." Dr. Mitchell shot up, his face flushed with anger and fear. "Your Honor, this is getting out of hand. The child is making baseless accusations." "I can prove everything I'm saying," David calmly replied, opening his school backpack and pulling out a surprisingly neat manila folder. "I have here copies of 17 lawsuits from the past 5 years where Wellington Industries purchased properties from financially distressed families for far below market value, using inside information obtained from his connections at local banks." Janet looked at her son, her heart constricting. She was watching David, a 9-year-old boy, turn a custody hearing into an impromptu criminal investigation, armed only with his sharp intellect, tireless determination, and hours spent at a public library. In the breathless silence of the courtroom, David continued, his voice like a rushing stream washing away all lies. "One of those families," he said gently, pulling printed photos from the folder, "was a small bakery owner. The Santos family, Mexican immigrants who worked 18 hours a day. Mr. Wellington learned through a friend at the bank that they were 3 months behind on their loan because their youngest son had been hospitalized for an emergency." Robert Wellington was now visibly drenched in sweat, cold beads rolling down his temples. He tried to interrupt, his voice filled with panic. "This has nothing to do with—" "It has everything to do with it," David cut in, his eyes as sharp as knives. "Because it shows a pattern of behavior. A man who preys on vulnerable, struggling families for financial gain. And now he's trying to prey on his own family for the exact same reason." Judge Harrison flipped through the documents David had presented, his expression growing more and more serious, his eyes showing a mix of astonishment and indignation. "Where did you get this information, David?" he asked, his voice heavy with thought. "Public court records, local newspaper archives, corporate incorporation documents in the state database." David listed each source carefully, like a true legal expert. "Ms. Rodriguez taught me that the truth is almost always publicly available. You just have to know where to look." Another moment of silence passed, broken only by the sharp, ragged breaths of those in the room. Dr. Mitchell attempting one last objection, his voice pathetically weak. "Even if these accusations were true," he said, the denial unconvincing, "which we do not admit, they do not change the fact that my client can provide a better educational opportunity for the child." David smiled. It was not the innocent smile of a child. It was the calculating grin of a person who had saved his strongest card, an ace for the very end. "On the subject of education," he said, opening the final section of his notebook, his movements slow and deliberate, "I would like to share something interesting about Mr. Wellington's real educational plan for me." It was at that moment that Robert Wellington understood he had been completely, utterly wrong. His 9-year-old son was not only intelligent, but he was strategic, and he had uncovered secrets that even his own lawyers didn't know. He knew a storm was coming. In the dead silent courtroom, everyone waited for the final revelation, which was promised to be even more devastating than everything they had already heard. Everyone was asking themselves, what had David discovered about Robert's real educational plan? And how could a child build a more powerful case than a millionaire legal team with nothing but a public library and the help of a dedicated librarian? On the topic of education, David repeated, opening the final section of his notebook with the precision of a surgeon, every motion exuding confidence and thorough preparation. I'd like to share Mr. Wellington's real plan for me. Robert Wellington swallowed hard, his throat dry. His anxious eyes darted back and forth between his lawyer and the child who had become his worst nightmare. In one of my 4 visits with him over the past 9 years, David continued slowly, each word a knife twisting in Robert's gut. I overheard a very interesting phone call. Mr. Wellington was talking to someone about getting the kid sorted out after he gained custody. Dr. Mitchell jumped to his feet, his face pale with alarm. Your Honor, private conversations cannot be— I can prove every word, David interjected without a moment's hesitation. He pulled out a small digital voice recorder from his backpack. The small object suddenly became a piece of priceless evidence. Ms. Rodriguez taught me that documenting evidence is the foundation of any legal case. The silence that followed was truly deafening, so heavy you could hear your own heartbeat. Robert Wellington was now visibly shaking his fingers, drumming nervously on the table, as he realized he had completely underestimated his son's intelligence and preparation. He had dug his own grave. This recording was made during his visit to my apartment 6 months ago. David explained to the judge, his tone chillingly calm. Mr. Wellington thought I was doing my homework in my room, but I had left the recorder in the living room. Judge Harrison took the device and examined it closely. His eyes filled with contemplation. David, are you sure you want to present this evidence to the court? I'm absolutely sure, Your Honor. A small beep sounded, and then the recording's audio filled the quiet courtroom, every word crystal clear. Robert Wellington's unmistakable voice rang out on the phone, calculating and callous. Look, as soon as I get custody, the kid goes straight to Riverside Military Academy. It's a tough boarding school in Colorado. They know how to handle problematic kids. He'll be there until he's 18, and I'll have full access to the inheritance for educational expenses. The voice on the other end was unclear, but Robert continued, his greed and contempt for David clear in every word. Exactly, $500 a month for his boarding. The rest is mine. The kid doesn't even have to know about the money. It's a perfect solution. His mother is out of the picture. I get access to the funds and still look like a responsible father. Janet put her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. She had never known Robert had such a cruel and calculating plan for David, turning her son into a tool for profit. Dr. Mitchell was ashen, realizing his client had just self-destructed with his own words. Every arrangement, every calculation had fallen apart. There's more, David said, calmly stopping the recording as if to add one more fatal blow. This part is about what he really thinks of me. The second part of the recording was even more ruthless, Robert Wellington's words sounding like knives stabbing into David's heart and into the conscience of everyone listening. It's not just the money. The kid is too smart for his own good. He asks too many questions. He observes things. It's best to keep him away until he's 18, and I can get my finances sorted out. Kids like that, you don't want them to think they're better than people. Robert Wellington, his face drained of all color, suddenly screamed, his voice filled with desperation and rage. This is a trap! He set me up! Robert Wellington yelled in despair. He deliberately provoked me. A 9-year-old can't possibly what? David interrupted, his voice as sharp as a knife, chillingly decisive. Can't be smart, can't defend himself, can't expose the truth about a father who sees his own child as a problem to be solved. Judge Harrison turned off the voice recorder, his eyes now stern and full of judgment, looking directly at Robert Wellington. Mr. Wellington, this recording, combined with the financial evidence presented, paints a very clear picture of your true motives. The courtroom fell silent, all eyes on Robert as if to pierce through his facade of hypocrisy. Your Honor. David continued, giving Robert no chance to object. I also discovered that Riverside Military Academy has a very poor record. In the past 5 years, there have been 3 student suicides there. The facility is under federal investigation for physical and emotional abuse of minors. David's words were like daggers plunging into the hearts of those present. A wave of disgust filled the room as everyone realized Robert Wellington was willing to send his own son into a toxic environment just for money. Dr. Mitchell, in one last desperate attempt, tried to play his final card. Your Honor, even considering these accusations, the fact remains that my client has superior financial resources. For what? David interrupted, his voice bitter but firm. To send me to a place where children die, to use my inheritance money while pretending to care, to isolate me from the only person who truly loves me, the one who has sacrificed her whole life for me. Robert Wellington finally lost all composure, every ounce of self-control collapsing. He screamed, his face red with anger and fear. You're just an arrogant kid who doesn't know his place. You are my father, and I am a stranger of your blood. David replied with a chilling calm that made the entire room shiver. His eyes looked directly into Robert's fearless, holding only disappointment and a deep sadness. A real father doesn't try to get rid of his son to steal his money. The judge struck his gavel decisively to restore order, the sound echoing loudly in the silent room. Mr. Wellington, sit down immediately, or you will be removed from this courtroom. The judge's gaze was stern, allowing no more chaos. David turned to the last page of his notebook, each motion slow and deliberate, as if he wanted to prolong the moment before delivering the final blow. Your Honor, I have one last thing to say, something I discovered about the real reason my grandmother set up that trust fund. Robert Wellington grew paler by the second, cold sweat beading on his skin. He knew an even more terrifying secret was about to be revealed. I found a letter from her in the probate records. A letter addressed to me to be opened only when I turned 16. David took a deep breath, the suspense in the room reaching its peak. But the librarian helped me learn that I could petition to have it opened early in the case of a custody dispute. And then the final bomb was about to detonate, shaking not only the courtroom, but also challenging everyone's preconceptions about a child. She wrote that she knew Robert was never a good father, that she established the fund to protect me from him, and that if he ever tried to get custody of me, just for the money, I should use all the resources in the fund to defend myself. David closed the notebook with a small clack and looked directly at Robert Wellington. The boy's eyes were clear, yet incredibly powerful. She even hired a private investigator to document all of his financial schemes over the years. It's all on file with the fund administrator. Robert Wellington sank into his chair, completely defeated. His face was now colorless, his eyes vacant. He finally realized that he had been completely defeated by a 9-year-old child, a child he had only ever seen as a troublesome obstacle, a tool for his own gain. His empire of lies had been toppled by his own son. Judge Harrison struck his gavel decisively, the sound echoing like a final verdict, ending all pretense. Based on all the evidence presented, including the financial documents, the audio recording, and the plaintiff's history of behavior, the motion for custody is hereby denied in its entirety. Furthermore, I am ordering a full investigation into the potential fraudulent use of the trust fund. Dr. Mitchell whispered urgently to Robert, but it was clear the case was completely lost, with nothing left to salvage. David calmly gathered his documents, maintaining the same extraordinary composure he had shown throughout the trial. Your Honor, I would like to make one final request. You may speak, David. Judge Harrison said, his voice now mixed with clear respect. I want Mr. Wellington to know that I didn't do this out of anger or revenge. David said, his eyes once again looking directly at Robert, no longer with anger, but with deep sadness and resolve. I did it because every child deserves to have a family that truly loves them, not one that sees them as a financial opportunity. As Robert Wellington was escorted out of the courtroom by security after the judge ordered his immediate arrest for the conspiracy to commit fraud, David finally allowed a small smile to appear on his face. It was a smile of relief and victory, but also of a premature maturity. In that quiet courtroom, a 9-year-old child had proven that intellect, preparation, courage, and genuine love could defeat any amount of wealth and privilege. But David's victory wasn't just a custody case. It was the beginning of a transformation that would change his family's life forever, and even the way the justice system viewed the voices of children. Three years have passed since that historic day in court, and David Thompson's life has changed in ways that even his precocious intellect could not have predicted. The audio recording that brought down Robert Wellington not only helped David win his case, but also went viral on social media, turning him into a national symbol of a generation of children who refused to accept injustice in silence. The video amassed over 50 million views and inspired legislative changes in 17 states across the United States, paving the way for children's voices to be heard more often in cases that directly affect them. Today we welcome 12-year-old David Thompson, the boy who stunned America 3 years ago when he defended his mother in court, armed with nothing but his wits and a public library. The host of America's most watched morning show introduced. David, now taller, wearing stylish new glasses, but still with his trademark calm and humility, smiled. "I just want to be known as David, a person who learned that every child has a voice even when adults pretend not to listen." The studio audience rose in a standing ovation, their applause lasting for an extended period. Janet, David's mother, stood backstage in her nursing supervisor uniform. She had received the promotion after her story sparked a nationwide campaign in support of working single mothers who do their best to raise their children. In honor of David's brave actions and Janet's resilience, the hospital where she worked established a scholarship fund in her name, the David Thompson Program for the children of low-income employees, opening doors to the future for many generations. The host, with a tone of admiration, continued, "The boy's mother is also here today. Janet, how does it feel to see your son become an inspiration for millions of families?" Janet walked onto the stage, still a bit shy under the lights and the crowd's attention, but her eyes shone with the same radiant pride she had on that day in court. "David was always special," she said, her voice choked with emotion but filled with love. "But what I am most proud of isn't his intellect, but his heart. He could have just boasted about his story, but he chose to use it to help other families, to turn his pain into a powerful force for change." And that was the truth. Over the past 3 years, David has been tireless. He has visited schools in underprivileged communities, not afraid to stand before hundreds of children, teaching them about their basic legal rights, sparking a fire of hope in young souls. His book, Every Child Has a Voice, had become a national phenomenon. A bestseller, with all profits going to a charitable foundation that provides free legal aid to families in custody disputes who cannot afford to defend themselves. "David, tell me about your fascinating law library project," the host asked, her eyes full of curiosity and admiration. "I once thought since the public library saved me." David began, his hands gently adjusting his glasses, a gesture that had become his own familiar trademark. How many other kids are in a similar situation and don't know who to turn to? He looked directly into the camera, his eyes filled with a deep understanding. "We created small sections in 1,200 public libraries with books on children's rights, written in simple, easy-to-understand language, along with computers that provide free access to basic legal resources." The camera panned to Janet, who was quietly wiping away tears. In 3 years, she had watched her son, from a boy who had to fight for himself, turn his personal pain into a broad social movement, a beacon of justice for children. Her pride surged, mixed with choked-up emotion. At the same time, on the other side of the city, Robert Wellington was watching the TV show from his small apartment in a Chicago suburb. His hair was gray. His clothes were simple, and he was working as a salesman at an electronics store, the only job he could find after his story was exposed to the public. The court-ordered investigation not only uncovered his conspiracy to defraud David's trust fund, but also revealed a sophisticated network of financial fraud, which caused Wellington Industries to completely collapse. Robert lost everything: his company, his luxurious mansion, his broken marriage, and the reputation he had built for so many years. His former partners sued him for fraud, and he had to serve 18 months in jail, facing the full punishment of the law. "The kid is on TV again," he muttered, turning off the TV in a fit of anger, his face full of bitterness and helplessness. Not a week had gone by in the past 3 years without news about David, and each time it reminded the world of Robert's crimes and his downfall. What pained Robert the most, and also what made him feel the most ashamed, was that David had never spoken ill of him publicly. When asked about his biological father, the boy always answered with a maturity and forgiveness that made Robert feel even more ashamed, making him realize the vast difference between himself and his son. "I hope he finds peace and understands that true love cannot be bought or stolen," David had said in a recent interview. "Holding a grudge doesn't help, but setting boundaries is necessary to protect the ones you love." David's words were not just an act of forgiveness, but also a profound lesson in growing up. Back at the studio, the host asked the final question, one that touched the hearts of millions. David, what advice do you have for other children facing difficult family situations? David thought for a moment, his eyes pausing on a distant point, and then looked directly into the camera, his voice carrying the experience of someone who had faced a giant and won. First, you are not alone. Second, you have more power than you think. And third, the truth always finds a way to win even when it seems impossible. He paused for a moment, then continued, his voice ringing out full of inspiration. Don't let anyone make you believe you're too small to make a difference. I was 9 when I changed my life and my mom's life forever. You can change yours too. These words were like a rallying cry, touching the hearts of millions of children, sparking a fire of hope and strength. 6 months later, David received a special letter. It was from Sofia Martinez, a 10-year-old girl in Los Angeles, who had used the Cool LA Library Project to help her immigrant grandmother avoid an unfair deportation. At the end of the letter, the girl wrote, "Thank you for teaching me that every child has a voice. I used mine and saved my family." Janet found David reading the letter in his room, surrounded by hundreds of similar letters from children across the country, letters filled with gratitude and stories of change. How does it feel to know that your courage has inspired so many people? She asked, her voice full of love and pride. David gently folded Sophia's letter and placed it in the special box where he kept all his correspondence. Those letters were the most vivid evidence of the impact he had made. I remember you once said that sometimes the scariest things in life are the most important, right? Janet nodded, remembering that moment vividly, her words having become a guiding light for her son. I get it now. If Robert Wellington hadn't tried to tear us apart, maybe I would have never discovered that a child can absolutely change the world once adults stop underestimating us. On that same day, David received a life-changing phone call again. Harvard University, one of the most prestigious schools in the world, invited him to join a special, fully funded scholarship program in law and social justice, the first of its kind in the world, specifically for students under 16 with outstanding achievements in social leadership. Are you going to accept? Janet asked after David hung up, her voice full of excitement. I'll accept, but on one condition. David smiled, a radiant, determined smile. I want to use my education to create a legal system that protects all children, not just the ones who are smart enough to defend themselves. Years later, when David Thompson became the youngest licensed attorney at 16, his first case was not to defend an individual, but to sue the education system itself for not teaching basic children's rights in public schools. He won, setting a precedent that made legal education mandatory for all American students, ensuring that no child would ever have to face injustice in silence again. Robert Wellington never truly recovered from his fall. Living a frugal life and working jobs that just paid the bills, he sometimes thought about the extraordinary son he had lost to his own greed. In those rare moments of honesty with himself, he realized that David had become the kind of man he had never had the courage to be. The story of David Thompson proves that true power comes not from money or connections, but from intellect, courage, and unconditional love. A 9-year-old boy defeated a corrupt system with nothing but a public library, an unyielding will, and the powerful truth. David learned that when you fight for what's right, the universe stands with you. And Robert Wellington learned that underestimating a determined child is the most expensive mistake a person can make. And millions of children around the world learned that their voices matter. Their rights are real, and they are never too small to fight for justice. David's greatest revenge was not in destroying Robert Wellington, but in building a legacy that saved thousands of families from the same injustices he faced, and in lighting a beacon of hope for a more just future for all children.